Today, we're going to count down the 1976 presidential election. We're going to go in order of each state from the widest margin to the narrowest. And this was a close one. Jimmy Carter was the winner with 297 electoral votes out of 23 states plus D.C. That was worth just a majority of the national popular vote at 50.1. Gerald Ford, who assumed the presidency, took the loss for the Republicans. He got 240 electoral votes out of 27 states. So more states, but that was only worth 48% of the popular vote. So the national margin here was 2.1% for Carter. Let's see how that translates down into each state. So here's the 1976 electoral map. We're going to fill this out with shading. The darkest colors have a margin of 10% or more. The very lightest colors are going to be under 1%. Those are the tilt margins. So we've got 4 levels of shading. Let's get into the countdown. We'll start with the absolute widest blowout on the entire map. It's the same story in every election. It's Washington, D.C. and win for Carter by 65%. Then the widest state on the map is Carter's home state of Georgia. He won that by almost 34%. The next state also went to Carter. It's Arkansas. His margin there was 30. Now we've got the first state for Gerald Ford. His best state was Utah, and his margin was about 28.7, 6 points less than that. Also some red states. We've got Idaho. Then it's Alaska. Then we've got Nebraska. Now we're already under a 20% margin. Also for Ford, it's Wyoming at 19.5, 3 points less than that. For Ford, it's Arizona. Now we've got some Carter states. It's West Virginia. Then a little bit narrower and voting to the right of West Virginia is Massachusetts. Continuing the count, we've got 3 states all at around 13% for Carter. First is Alabama, then it's South Carolina, and then we've got Tennessee. Just a fraction under that is another Carter state. It's Minnesota. Then we've got one for Ford. Number 38 is Colorado at 11.5. Then back on the East Coast for Carter, it's Rhode Island. Just about the same percent in the same area, it's New Hampshire for Ford. Also going for Ford is neighboring Vermont. Down into the Sun Belt region, we've got one for Carter. It's North Carolina at 11.1. That's the last state with a double-digit margin. Now we've got some Ford states coming in at around 7.5. First, it's Indiana. Then it's Kansas. Then a little bit northwest, we've got Montana. Number 30, still over 7% for Carter. We've got Kentucky. Also in his direction at 6%, it's Maryland. Now we're under 6%. We've got North Dakota voting for Ford. Then a couple of Carter states, not near each other at all. We're down in the south, we've got Louisiana. Then in the East Coast, it's Delaware. Number 25 is Ford's home state of Michigan. He won that by over 5%. Slightly under that for Carter is Florida. Slightly under that for Ford is Connecticut. Now we're into the lean margins, under 5%. Starting at 4.5%, we've got New York for Carter. Then out west, it's Nevada for Ford. Under 4%. In the northwest, it's Washington for Ford. Now we've got 4 states for Carter. First is the bellwether state back then of Missouri. Then we've got Texas. Then under 3%, it's the Rust Belt state of Pennsylvania. And at 2.5%, we've got Hawaii. Now some Ford states. In the southwest, it's New Mexico. Then out east, it's New Jersey. Then at 2%, it's Illinois. Now we're under 2%. For Carter, it's Mississippi. Then out west, going red for Ford is California. Now we're into the top 10. First, we've got Wisconsin voting for Carter by 1.7. Number 9 is South Dakota for Ford by 1.5. Number 8 is Maine's 1st Congressional District for Ford by 1.3. About the same margin also for Ford is Virginia. Number 6 for Ford at 1.2% is Oklahoma. Into the top 5 at 1% for Ford, we've got Iowa. Now we're into the top 4. We've got the tilt margins. First is Maine at large at 0.8%. That voted for Ford at just like number 3. That's Maine's 2nd Congressional District. That was about 0.3%. A fraction under that, we've got Carter's narrowest state. That's Ohio. And that leaves number 1, the closest nail-biter in the 1976 election. Went for Ford, it's Oregon, the margin 0.16%. So that's the map, and most of it doesn't at all look like anything we're familiar with today. Sure, there's some states in the Great Plains that voted red, and you've got a few blue states, Hawaii, Minnesota, and some on the East Coast that voted blue. But much of the map is pretty much the opposite of what we would see today. West Virginia, one of the reddest states out there, voted to the left of all the other blue states we would think of today. You've pretty much got most of the South back into its solid blue Democratic state. But then you've got the West Coast, it's red. Some states in the Northeast, including Vermont, are red. The Rust Belt was a split. You did have Ford winning his home state. Carter, of course, dominated in his state of Georgia. But a lot of these margins are actually not total landslides. In the 80 and the 84 election, those had a ton that were blowouts. But this had more than half, 33 that were under 10%, and 22 of them were under 5. So a lot of these could have gone either way. Oregon was the closest state, followed closely by Ohio. Today, of course, we would think of Ohio as the redder state. But if Ford would have won that one, then this would have been extremely close in the Electoral College. But instead, we've got a lot of blue states going red and a lot of red states going blue. A close election nationally. Ford won more states, but Carter was able to come out just on top where it mattered a little bit more. A very unusual looking map, but that's the countdown for the 1976 presidential election. So let me know in the comments. What are your thoughts about how these states voted? Which margins shock you by how wide they are? Which ones stand out to you as voting in the other direction? Let me know what you think about this map down below on your way out. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.